I am here today to present a perspective that we normally say it's the least one represented at the discussions for the benchmarks regulation, which is the user's perspective. And I know Frederic Bomper, haven't heard, Frederic, your presentation, but I'm sure in the first panel you presented our views concerning the technical advice. Now, on the user's perspective, we have a very concrete view concerning the asset managers. And very briefly, I'm sure you already heard it in the first panel by Frederic, just to say how we as asset managers are supervised entities and therefore supervised users when it comes to the use of benchmarks. And we do it pretty much in two ways, either via indices that are used as target for index-linked funds, such as the passive managed funds or the ETFs, or indices that are used to evaluate the performance of an investment fund. So in that way, again, we don't produce, we don't calculate, we're not involved in the ongoing administration of input data related to benchmarks, and therefore we have very much welcomed the fact that now at the level 1 text there is a clear indication of investment funds being part of the use of what is the definition of a use of benchmarks. Now, in the case of us as supervised entities, we have been covered already prior to the benchmarks regulation by a very extensive list of requirements. And therefore, one more reason that we welcome the benchmarks regulation was that we really were interested in this level playing field for all different types of users, because particularly us as users, we have already been covered by extensive references as to which kind of indices we can use. And this comes by our sectoral directives, UCITS and AFMD. And in particular, in the case of UCITS, we have extensive requirements as to which kind of indices and which kind of disclosure as to the indices that we are using should we be putting out to our own investors. So I will be coming back again later on in my slides on the ESMA guidelines on ETFs and other UCITS issues, where there is an extensive reference to the due diligence requirements and the disclosure requirements we're having when it comes to the indices that we are using. But just to say already that we are a very concrete group of users that we were already coded by regulation before the benchmarks regulation when it came to the use of financial indices. Now, from the asset management industry's perspective, we have been welcoming the benchmarks regulation for a number of reasons, because indeed we do want to restore market confidence, and we do think that there is a need for increased transparency. Transparency is a key pivotal issue for us for a number of reasons, and because, as I said, we do believe that a level playing field for all stakeholders out there should be in place. We have very much welcomed the level 1 text changing the definition of what is a user from the definition on what is used, because we believe this helps maintain a level playing field for everybody, not specific groups of users should be targeted, rather than whatever is used should be targeted in a similar way. And very briefly to say, apart from the second part on transparency that we are very much focused on, we were also very interested on what is used, and therefore what are the indices that are used to be covered by this regulation. Now, I know this falls into the technical advice and not on the draft RTS, which is the subject of this panel, but we very much were focusing on what is an index made available to the public, and we were keen on saying that there was a very clear political choice made at the level 1 text that not every index that is out there, no matter which is the scope of users and the number of users, is to be covered by this regulation. Only those that are made available to the public. So those that aren't to be covered. Now, the ESMA's technical advice, we believe, has progressed if we consider when we started previously in March 2016, and it makes reference to an potentially undetermined number of recipients, which we think can work as long as we're sure that also at the level of national regulators, this won't be afterwards turned into whatever is out there is to be covered by the regulation. Now, coming back to the draft RTS, what is very key for us here is the transparency and the requirements that are focusing on transparency, because we believe transparency as to the methodology, but the input data And actually, I was very happy to hear before the previous speaker saying that where does input data begins, where does ends, and when does methodology starts and ends. It's a very complicated and a lot of times intransparent definition to give. So we believe in general transparency on input data and on methodology can help achieve multiple goals. It can certainly limit interest and capacity to abuse the input data and therefore the benchmark and the way they represent market realities. Transparency can enhance our own and therefore also the market confidence on benchmarks, but also it can help ensure a level playing field. And it can help ensure that indices are not used in one or another way, not necessarily that the way that the regulator has intended to, in order to be used as regulatory ways to apply multi-pricing and very abusive policies to the end investors, to asset managers, and therefore finally to the end investors. Now, if I come directly to the draft RTS, we as a FAMA, we responded to a number of different draft RTSs that were proposed by ESMA. I'll begin with the Oversight Function Committee, and there we said that if we indeed want to have a clear understanding of the market, of what is the reality that a given benchmark is representing, we would believe that in the oversight function committees, supervised entities such as asset managers should be represented. On the code of conduct, we believe, as far as we've seen, the code of conduct for contributors, that ESMA has pretty much gotten it right, because there is a clear attribution of roles and there is an oversight role for the administrator when it comes to the policy applied on an ongoing basis by the contributors. However, there again, we need to say that I'm coming back now to the ESMA guidelines, as I said in my previous slide. There, in the previous framework that was envisaged for the asset managers, it was foreseen that we are supposed to assess how the conflicts of interest are applied by the administrators. Since now it's clear that we are users, and in the cases that we are users, I'm not going to enter into this kind of debate, but for the instances, a supervised entity as an asset manager is a user, it's clear that they have no way and no interference with the administrating arrangements. So how are we supposed to assess the application of a conflict of interest? We think ESMA guidelines in this way should be reviewed, saying that as long as an index is foreseen, is included in the ESMA register, we are supposed to believe that and to consider that this given benchmark administrator is complying with its own oversight functions. Now, I'm coming on the key point for us, which, as I said already, is transparency. And on the transparency, there has been a shift from the transparency of input data, which was initially foreseen in the Commission's text, to the transparency of methodology. Now, we surely don't agree with that, but we believe there is still room to be based on that and make sure that the level playing field, together with the other set of goals that I have explained, can be ensured. When it comes to asset managers, when using benchmarks, again, the ESMA guidelines apply. Every user, we believe, when using a benchmark, there are key concrete elements that the user has to know, and that enough transparency on the input data and the methodology should be in place. The definition and objective, the universe of the benchmark, the components, and in case there is a rebalancing, the rebalancing frequencies, the maximum, minimum weightings, the names of individual components. Now, all these we can already find in the draft RTS. However, in the case of asset managers, again, the ESMA guidelines that precede the level 2 and the level 1 benchmarks regulation go deeper in a way that we are supposed to, especially in the disclosure requirements, go and fetch this additional input by the administrators, who, according to level 1 and level 2, will not be obliged to give to us. So And in order to be effective, we even engaged into an industry practice. You can see public in our FAMA website that there is a questionnaire that we try to put a standard formal template of questions for every benchmark that we can go ask the benchmark administrator to provide for information which would help us comply with the information that is requested from us by the ESMA guidelines. We had non-response, at least the ones we had were not really covering the questionnaire. So it's clear that BMR, the benchmark regulation, doesn't require the administrator to give us this information. We cannot do it ourselves. So there is a policy, there is a problem of policy, and there is a need of a practical solution. From our perspective, it's either the alignment of the ESMA guidelines with the benchmarks regulation when it comes to disclosure requirements, which necessarily will lead to the deletion of all the additional requirements from the ESMA guidelines, or, even more difficult, adding to the level 2 measures more granular and more detailed information so that the benchmark administrator will be able to, will be required to give us the additional information. And I'm sure a lot of you, especially benchmark administrators, will disagree with further granular transparency. Or we have now the benchmark statement where a concrete reference can be made whether a benchmark, an index, is UCITS compliant or not. We believe the third option is the simpler, not just for us, but also for all relevant parties. But we just say we don't want to preempt any solution. We just want a solution, whichever that might be. Last, and I conclude, when it comes to the compliance statement, we see now that instead of the previous version that requested the compliance statement only for each and every benchmark, an individual compliance statement, we now have a compliance statement for not just a family of benchmarks, but for an identified group of benchmarks, which means that the user has to identify which provisions are applied or disapplied for which index, and we find that this is a burdensome and not necessary exercise. We think it should be, the compliance statement should be a user-friendly and simple exercise, and therefore we would really much like to go to the previous version of one compliance statement for benchmark or family of benchmarks. Thank you very much.